I think he's trying to adjust my. Good? السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So I'm sorry, we have to fiddle with the microphone every time. It's a work in progress. But it's my fault. Apparently I have a very low, my volume is not that high, so apparently it causes some problems. But everybody can hear me fine? Yes? طيب. Welcome to a new session of the stories of the prophets. Today, inshallah, we're going to be starting with the story of Musa alayhi salam, the prophet Musa. And just a kind of warning, this will probably, it's the longest series of the prophets that are mentioned in the Quran. The prophet, Prophet Musa alayhi salam was mentioned almost like over 130 times in the Quran. I said over 130, ya Sheikh. I'm still right. All right. So, what was I saying? Longest. And Bani Israel and the story of Musa alayhi salam is mentioned quite often in the Quran. And so naturally speaking, there's a whole lot of information associated with it. Mostly we're going to be resorting to the Quran, complementing it from the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But just as a heads up, this will probably take us anywhere between 10 to 11 weeks, inshallah, right? We'll be taking breaks in the middle, so you guys won't get bored of things. I'll be talking this week, and I think maybe next week, and then break afterwards, and then continue back again a few times. But just to kind of diversify and change things, inshallah. So as we start the story of Musa alayhi salam, one important thing we need to or I wanted to do before we dive into the story is to understand the background, right, of the environment or the situation or the circumstances that Musa alayhi salam was born into. And I'm mentioning this because we know that the tribes of Bani Israel originally came from where? Where did they come from? Before that? Ibrahim, they're the children of Ibrahim alayhi salam, right? So Ibrahim, Ishaq, and Yaqub. And where were they living? Isham. So how did they move to Egypt? That has to do with the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, right? So the origin of how Bani Israel migrated from Shem all the way to Egypt had to do with the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. And that's a completely different story, inshallah. We're going to take that some other time. But I think we're going to do it differently. We're going to do it on some other day with taking a look at the tafsir of Surah Yusuf alayhi salam. But essentially, when I'm going to start off when Yusuf alayhi salam was in Egypt, and he had brought his family, right, all his siblings, his 11 siblings, his father and his mother, Yaqub alayhi salam, and the wife of Yaqub alayhi salam, who's the mother of Yusuf, and they stayed in Egypt. At that time, when Yusuf alayhi salam was the Aziz, which was the minister, right? It's a word for minister. Aziz is a person, it's a political position. The Aziz of Egypt, he was the minister of treasury. the Yusuf alayhi salam and his brothers, uh, they were treated very well, right? And it was the people of Egypt had honored, Yusuf alayhi salam and his family, and they felt a lot of gratitude towards them because Yusuf alayhi salam, as the treasurer, he's the one that was able to navigate the drought situation that happened in Egypt, and they understood the piety of Yusuf alayhi salam and that he was a prophet, and so the Egyptian community at that time, the natives of Egypt, felt some sort of respect, felt some sort of a debt that they owe to Yusuf alayhi salam and his family. And so from that day on, Yusuf alayhi salam, his brothers, and the offsprings from that kind of spurred the 12 tribes of Bani Israel later on, they were always respected, right? Especially when we're talking about they were considered also figureheads of a religious house also at the same time. However, by the time, if you look at these verses in the Quran, by the time Musa alayhi salam was sent, that social environment, that feeling of gratitude or that good treatment had drastically changed. Something happened over a few hundred years that resulted in Bani Israel, on the other hand, the people of Bani Israel, that lineage, to be treated in a complete different way. And unfortunately, what happened is throughout the years, the reason that this happened is that throughout the years, the Bani Israel slowly started moving away from implementing the teachings of the religion, right? With the teachings of Yusuf alayhi salam or essentially Yusuf alayhi salam and what he had established. They slowly started moving away from those teachings due to the worldly distractions, right? Worldly distractions around them, the hunger for power and wealth. And what that ended up resulting is that a lot of the people of Bani Israel that had certain positions, because historically what they had, they misused it. And they started treating the natives in Egypt in a specific way, which resulted on the natives of Egypt, which in the Arabic world for it is al-Aqbat, to turn on them. And by the time that the different pharaohs, right, the pharaohs, Fir'aun is a title, it means king, the different pharaohs that took position, that animosity started growing so much to the point that when it came to the time of Musa alayhi salam, there were two clear segments of society, right? There were the Aqbat and Bani Israel. The Aqbat were treated, or they saw themselves as the rightful owners. They believed that they were the elites of society, and they had the right to use the people of Bani Israel. People of Bani Israel were considered the lower class, the lower status, those who were created to serve the people from the Aqbat. And it got so bad to the point that quite often the people from Bani Israel were treated similar to how a person would treat his mule or their bull, like their farming bull, for example, right? That the farmer from an Aqbat would go out on his mule or his, the bull that he would use, or whatever the case is, in order to plow the earth, and would have with him the person from Bani Israel. And after the entire day of working, he would feed his mule and his bull and the person from Bani Israel. They lived through years of oppression because of that, whatever happened throughout history. But one important thing that we need to learn from is that it is the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that whenever a group of people follow the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and abide by it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevates them and honors them. And as they move away from that religion, that support of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is removed, right? And again, obviously because they sin and go so forth, so that support of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is removed, but then also they are despised by other people around them, not just by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes. What if I do it, Sheikh? Yes. No. That's a misunderstanding. The word Aqbat refers to the natives of Egypt, irrelevant what religion they are, right? In modern time, the Christians claim to be Aqbat, but that's a interesting claim. It's not a true claim. the natives of Egypt were called Aqbat no matter where they're from. They were mostly polytheists. Yes, yes. So the word Aqbat over here just talks about the natives. It's the word for the natives of inhabitants of Egypt, regardless of whatever faith they belong to, whether it's polytheists or even some of them later on that accepted Judaism, right? Followed in the footsteps of Musa alayhi salam, or those who followed later on, Christians, but also a lot of them converted to Islam, right? So it's a bit of a play on words sometimes that the Christians say that we are the natives of Egypt, when in reality the majority of Christians in Egypt did convert to Islam, and so there is no really grounds for that. It's just a word that's referred to the natives of Egypt. It's an excellent question, by the way. Jazakumullah khair. Or a comment. طيب. So once again, one of the lessons that we can learn is that when we hold on to the faith of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevates us, but whenever we don't and we let it go, this is when we lose the support of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, there are many passages in the Quran that talk about the story of Musa alayhi salam, such as, for example, the Surah Al-Qasas, right? And then the other one is Surah Taha, you're right? Those are some of the longest passages that are associated with it. And so if you look at the beginning of Surah Al-Qasas, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the first few verses, and he says, طَاسِين مِيم تِلْكَ آيَاتُ الْكِتَابِ الْمُبِينِ نَتْلُ عَلَيْكَ مِن نَبَإِ مُوسَى وَفِرْعَوْنَ إِنَّ فِرْعَوْنَ بِالْحَقِّ لقوم يؤمنون إن فرعون علا في الأرض وجعل أهلها شيعا يستضعف طائفة منهم يذبح أبناءهم ويستحيي نساءهم إنه كان من المفسدين ونريد أن نمن على الذين استضعفوا في الأرض ونجعلهم أئمة ونجعلهم الوارثين. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these verses, when he was talking about Bani Israel, he was talking about إن فرعون علا في الأرض, right? When he says نتلو عليك من نبأ إسرائيل بالحق. So he said, we're going to relate to you or narrate to you or tell you the news of Musa and Fir'aun بالحق, in truth, لقوم يؤمنون, for people that believe. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, إن فرعون علا في الأرض وجعل أهلها شيعا يستضعف طائفة منهم يذبح أبناءهم ويستحيي نساءهم. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these verses depicts to us and shows us a scenery of, or the situation of Bani Israel at the time where Musa alayhi salam was sent. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described Fir'aun. He said, إِنَّ فِرْعَوْنَ عَلَى فِي الْأَرْضِ, right? So he exalted himself in the land. He had, the power. But over here, the exalted himself, the ala over here really has to do with aspects of arrogance, right? Fir'aun, being the Pharaoh of Egypt, thought himself as the Lord of the Aqbat. This is why he actually claimed to be their Lord. And at one point when he was challenging the people of why would you worship somebody else, he said, these are the rivers that run from beneath me. So this is how Fir'aun viewed himself. And this is a very important description, because a person who's arrogant, who has that disease of the heart, it would naturally affect how they interact with others. A person who has arrogance naturally views other people as not equals, but below, right? That they're entitled for everything and everybody else is not entitled. That they feel that they have the right to use others, right? And so this explains why, for example, Fir'aun and similarly the Aqbat, because of the support of Fir'aun, they had a similar behavior. This is why they treated Bani Israel the way they did. But that's just not the limit of it. Generally, a lot of the oppression that happens in any society, the root of it is one group feeling that they're better than another group, right? And that explains the entire situation of why Bani Israel is being oppressed and how that occurred. But also a person who has arrogance, do they tend to accept advice? They don't. Why? Because they're better, right? They're better. you're not smarter than me, you're not better than me, you're not any of these things. They would never ever accept some sort of advice. Irrelevant of who they are, whatever position they are, it is arrogance, right? That prevents a person from, accepting that kind of advice. Now, the other description right away, he said, وَجَعَلَ أَهْلَهَا شِيَعًا, right? وَجَعَلَ أَهْلَهَا شِيَعًا, which means he divided they're made the people into factions. That's what it means. So he separated them into groups. And as mentioned earlier, there was two distinct groups there. There was the Aqbat and the natives of Egypt and Bani Israel. Now, what did he do to the second? So these are some of the things that are the consequences of Fir'aun of that time because of this arrogance. What did he do after that? Right? So he divided them into two fractions. يَسْتَضْعِفُ طَائِفَةً مِنْهُمْ. He would oppress one of those factions. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning that. So one faction has all the rights in society, right? Has all the necessities, has all the whatever you can think about it, right? Rights to anything, right? They were considered the elites of society. It doesn't matter what social economical status they belonged to, because they were from a specific bloodline or from a specific group. They were considered to have rights, while others from Bani Israel that did not belong to that group, that were not from the natives, they were considered to have absolutely no rights whatsoever, right? They had no right to possess certain things or to attain access to certain things. And so this is what Fir'aun had done. يَسْتَضْعِفُ طَائِفَةً مِنْهُمْ. He would take their rights away. In fact, their freedom, for example, right? They were treated literally as slaves, even though they did not belong to anybody. Almost it was considered like a communal belonging to somebody else. You know public property? Bani Israel were public property, pretty much. But not just that. Bani Israel, naturally, any group of people who would be oppressed for a very long time, they will eventually retaliate. Right? They will eventually retaliate. And so Bani Israel started retaliating, and animosity naturally developed between both groups. The group that thinks themselves as the elite, right, and the group that is being oppressed. Animosity, heavy animosity starts developing, or developed already, and it just bubbled over. And Bani Israel started retaliating in different ways. Right, started retaliating in different ways. So then that ended up by Fir'aun, what is he doing? يُذَبِّحُ أَبْنَاءَهُمْ وَيَسْتَحْيِي نِسَاءَهُم. What he would do is that he would يُذَبِّح. The word يُذَبِّح is very descriptive. يُذَبِّح, which means to slaughter. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not say يَقْتُل, kill, because kill can be done in different ways. So Fir'aun didn't just kill the boys of Bani Israel and left the women to stay alive. We're going to get to that in a second of why this all happened. But it was described as that he would literally يُذَبِّح, which means to slaughter, which means it would be done by a knife. He would send his soldiers to the houses of anybody he would hear that they are pregnant from the females of Bani Israel, and wait for the child to come out. If it's a girl, they'll let her live. If it's a boy, they literally slaughter it with a knife, right? Just to tell you, to show the amount of oppression that is being there, and the complete disregard of any human life, right? Yes. يذبح يعني يكثر القتل. Well, no. It talks about the frequency and the amount, right? So يذبح, which means consistency over here, right? So this was done consistently. But what made Fir'aun do this? Right? That is the question. Why did he all of a sudden wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I'm going to slaughter the boys, right? This is not mentioned in the Quran, but it's mentioned in other books of tafsir, right, of why this happened. Fir'aun had seen a vision that a fire came out of one of the houses of Bani Israel, and it burnt all the houses around it except the houses that belonged to Bani Israel. Right? This was the vision. The vision was that there was a fire that came out of one of the houses of Bani Israel, and it burned all the surrounding houses except the houses that belong to Bani Israel, which means, which houses did they burn? The Aqbat, right? The natives of Egypt. And so Fir'aun sought out an interpretation for it. And the interpretation of his vision was that there was a child that will be born from Bani Israel, that the end of the Fir'aun will be upon his hand. And so he immediately ordered that all males that are born to Bani Israel to be killed, so that he would kind of protect himself essentially. Now, hello. Does this belong to somebody? We can take him, ya Shaykh. So. Alhamdulillah. All right, so now one thing that Fir'aun wanted to do essentially really was he wanted to weaken that group, Bani Israel, and not have, not give them the ability to fight. And so the best thing to do is to eliminate the males, right? That's the reality of things. The reality is we have to understand the nature of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created things. It is usually the males that are going to go to fend, fight, any strength of any society. If we're talking about physical strength, it is the males that will be able to withstand that. This is why if you have an army of males and an army of females, it is done. We're talking about over here swords and arrows and whatever the case is. And so Fir'aun wanted to eliminate any sort of strength or possibility of strength they can have, and so he wanted to remove all the males or newborn males. Then you're left with just elderly, right? And those are not a threat to anybody because they're too old to do anything and they don't have the desire for change. It is usually the young that always desire and have the aptitude to change. They're the ones that tend to carry the mantle of change. And throughout history, a lot of the change that happens, it could be an idea or encouragement from an elderly, but that carries the brunt, and a lot of the work is usually the younger population, right? And so this is what Fir'aun wanted to do. And so they would keep the females, and they kept them for other reasons, right? Because they needed slaves, but also, unfortunately, they were also used for their own pleasures. Fir'aun prevented any sort of intermarriage to happen between the Aqbat and Bani Israel, but he allowed them to essentially do whatever they want with the females, right? And so this is why they kept him. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He described them, إِنَّهُ كَانَ مِنَ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. That Fir'aun was from the corruptors. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَنُرِيدُ أَن نَمُنَّ عَلَى الَّذِينَ اسْتُضْعِفُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Right? That we want to confer favor upon those who were oppressed in the land and make them leaders and make them inheritors, which means to inherit the land. It's talking about Bani Israel. Now, one thing I want to mention is that there was a discussion between the Hasham, the people or the advisors around Fir'aun, regarding the decision that he made, right? Because they did kill almost every child male born. But they spoke to him and they said, listen, if you're going to kill every male, right, then we're not going to have any sort of strong men or young people to depend on in whatever we need to, right? Whether it is cropping or servitude or whatever the case is. And so then the ruling changed from killing every child that is born to go by years. 1 year they'd allow the boys to live, the other year they would slaughter every single boy, right? And I'm saying this ahead of time is because we know that Musa alayhi salam had a brother, his name was Harun, right? Why was Musa going to be chased to be killed and Harun not? Because Harun was born in the year that the boys were spared. Musa alayhi salam was not, right? He was born in the year that all the boys were supposed to be slaughtered. طيب. One thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, just to follow with the verses of the Quran, that He wanted to bestow His favors upon those who were oppressed and allow them to inherit the earth. Inherit which earth? That belonged to Fir'aun, right? And those who were with him because they were oppressors. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَنْمَكِّنَ لَهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَنْمَكِّنَ لَهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَنُرِيَ فِرْعَوْنَ وَهَامَانَ وَجُنُودَهُمَا مِنْهُمْ مَا كَانُوا يَحْذَرُونَ. Meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He wanted those oppressed people to be established on the land and to show Pharaoh, and his minister, Haman, and their soldiers through them that which that they had feared. What did Fir'aun fear? He feared Bani Israel, right? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so he felt that his kingdomship would be gone and that he would be kind of overthrown and people of Bani Israel would take over. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to show them, right, with their own eyes that whatever they feared can happen and will happen and they have no say in it because this is the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then in the following verses, He transfers us to the next scene of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created means and placed causes to save the life of Musa alayhi salam. Right? Because I mentioned Musa alayhi salam was born in the year that all boys were supposed to be slaughtered. So any woman from Bani Israel should be given birth, people know, and the soldiers will find out and they will chase him. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the following verse in Surah Al-Qasas, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَى أُمِّ مُوسَى أَنْ أَرْضِعِيهِ. Right? We awhayna, which means we inspired. Right? Wahy over here means inspiration. In the Quran, wahy has several meanings. One of them is inspiration. Similar to how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَى النَّحْلِ. Right? We inspired to the bees, which means He placed instinct in them. And so similarly, وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَى أُمِّ Musa, we inspired the mother of Musa, right? What should we do? Anardi'i, right? To breastfeed him, to suckle him. Now, why would that be important? Why would she, essentially the story is she'll suckle him and put him in a coffin and throw him into the water, okay? This is what essentially is going to happen. So why would why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, okay, let's step back a little bit, right? Ilham over here we said is an inspiration, right? And she acted upon that. And this was what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had inspired the mother of Musa to come up with, but He gave her strong conviction that this might be a means to protect her son. Because it's very difficult on a mother, now you want to think of it, to breastfeed a child and put him in a coffin and throw him in the water, right? Essentially, logically, what is usually going to happen? Drown, right? Essentially. Or drift to where it drifts, and nothing's going to happen. Or remember, back then there's still alligators, there's a bunch of other, wild animals. Many things can happen. Usually a mother would not do that. Right? Or she'd be afraid to take that step. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspired her and gave her the strength to realize the conviction to be able to take that step. Right? وَنَرْضِعِيهِ فَإِذَا خِفْتِ عَلَيْهِ فَأَلْقِيهِ فِي الْيَمِّ. Throw him into the water. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the mother of Musa to breastfeed him. Now, what I want to ask is, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give her that inclination? We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the power and control over all things, and the natural causes are not limited to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They don't limit Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The natural laws that He created are meant to be natural laws for His creation, but He, the one that created natural laws, they don't necessarily apply to Him. Is that right? So why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this case place that inspiration for His mother to breastfeed Musa and throw him into the Yam? So that what? He's going to what, Sheikh? Be attached with her? What do you mean? She's going to throw him in the water anyway. Why breastfeed him? Yes, I know, but did she know that? Ya Sheikh, I know, but this is not the norm, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have just saved him directly, not made him feel hungry, blinded the soldiers of Bani Israel from him. There's so many things that could have happened, right? But there's a reason for this. And part of that reason, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the wisdom, is that depending on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not mean we do not take the proper steps and means and preparation. This is called al-akhdh bil-asbab, right? taking or working with the means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us to utilize, right? So whatever action we take, even though we depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we take those actions depending on Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this world to function on specific natural laws. We don't depend that it's going to be broken, but rather we work with these natural laws depending on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yeah. وهزي إليك بجذع النخلة تساقط عليك رطبا جنيا. And so similarly, but it's a very interesting. So the Shaykh over here is mentioning that Maryam alayhi salam, the mother of Isa, when she gave birth to Isa alayhi salam, obviously she was weak, right? And she needed some sort of food. And she gave birth next to a palm tree. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made Isa alayhi salam speak and order her and told her, وَهُزِّ إِلَيْكِ بِجَذْعِ النَّخْلَةِ, shake the palm tree. Now, and I mentioned I think this before, has any of you ever tried to shake a palm tree? I don't know. When I was younger, we tried that. Do you guys do this anymore? Or you just no, right? You're stuck to your phones and devices and. طيب. Any of the older ones? Have you guys tried to shake trees before? When you're kids, is it easy to shake a tree? No, it's not, right? No matter how. Now Allah subhanahu wa taala still ordered Maryam to shake a palm tree. تُسَاقِطْ عَلَيْكِ, it will drop. رُطَبًا جَنِيًّا, right? Fresh dates will drop. Now, once again, this has to do with the taking the steps, the proper means for causes, and Allah will place blessings in certain things and make them work, right? We never don't take means, but this is one of the reasons, wallahu alam, is that to take the means to save a life. And so you don't throw a child somewhere or keep him somewhere without feeding them first. Because remember, they're children, they need quite often to be fed. Their stomach is small, they burn a lot of calories, they quite often have to be fed. And so when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered or inspired the mother of Musa alayhi salam, to feed Musa alayhi salam, then he ordered her to place him, or he inspired her to place him in the water so that he would not be killed. Now, do you just place a child in the water? No, so she put him in a coffin, tabut, made out of wood, like a casket made out of wood. Now, this is very interesting. Usually, what do we use caskets for? Deaths, right? Deaths. But subhanAllah, this was a means for Najat Musa alayhi salam. This was a means of saving Musa alayhi salam. It was a means to giving life to Musa alayhi salam. Right? And so that coffin itself was not just a means of life for Musa alayhi salam, but in the future was for Bani Israel, but it was also the death of Fir'aun. Right? That tabut. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he had ordered or inspired her to feed Musa alayhi salam, there was another wisdom behind it. Because he's going to be in that water for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows how long. Right? It could be a day or two, or whenever he reaches his destination, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that he's going to prevent Musa from accepting accepting being nursed by anybody else other than his mother, there's going to be a period of time where he's going to go hungry, right? And so that initial feeding period was important to sustain Musa alayhi salam and not die out of hunger, to keep him alive, right? Because he's going to stop feeding for that period of time until he's returned to his mother. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, أَدْحَيْنَا إِلَى أُمِّ, this is in Surah Taha, right? إِذْ أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَى أُمِّكَ ما يوحى أن اقذفيه في التابوت فاقذفيه في اليم فليلقِ اليم بالساحل يلتقطه عدو لي وعدو يأخذ عدو yes that's another verse يلتقطه يأخذه عدو لي وعدو له وألقيت عليك محبة مني, right? And so the transition is this, is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking to Musa alayhi salam, and he said, and I have bestowed my favors upon you again when I inspired your mother to feed you, right? And to throw him into the casket, right? Tabut. فَقْذِفِيهِ فِي الْيَمْ, throw him into the river, the Nile River. Now these were two orders, right? The third, فَلْيُلْقِهِ الْيَمُّ بِالسَّاحِلِ, and then the river was ordered to throw him by the shores. يَأْخُذْهُ عَدُوٌ لِي وَعَدُوٌ لَهُ, who will be taken by an enemy of mine, an enemy for him. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَأَلْقَيْتُ عَلَيْكَ مَحَبَّةً مِنِّي, and I bestowed upon you a love from me, وَلِتُصْنَعَ عَلَى عَيْنِي, so that you would also grow underneath my gaze and guidance. Now, Musa alayhi salam, right, as we mentioned, we talked about, like, subhanAllah, like, sometimes would be considered a means of death. This was a means of life, right? And then also a river, usually would not expect a river to take somebody else safely, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the controller of everything, right, ordered the river to deliver Musa alayhi salam to where he's supposed to care, right? And so what is considered usually means of death became means of life for Musa alayhi salam, right? And so this is a message that we can learn from this, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in complete control of everything, right? Subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the one that, based on whatever He decides, He creates whatever means in whatever time in the most appropriate way that He desires to allow certain things to happen in a specific way. A lot of times, subhanAllah, we feel things happen by chance, right? Like we call it serendipity, right? We travel countries and then we meet a person, we haven't seen them in 20 years in the right time, the right place. That is not just by chance. This is the planning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Because so many different things could have happened in different ways, this would not have happened. But this is the tadbir of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the planning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if we reflect on this, you can clearly see that, right? Like nobody in the right mind would throw a child in a river because it would be considered a means of death. But over here, once again, right, it became a means of life. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have to look at two things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given two orders to the mother of Musa and an order to the river, right? So He ordered Musa alayhi salam through inspiration to put him in a coffin, first order, and to throw him into the river, second order. And then He said, فَلْيُلْقِهِ الْيَمُّ بِالسَّاحِلِ. So it's an order to the river to throw him at the shore, right, of where they're gonna be taken by an enemy, right? Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also said, وَأَلْقَيْتُ عَلَيْكَ مَحَبَّةً مِنِّي, which means I have bestowed upon you love from me. Musa alayhi salam, whomever would see him, could not help but love him. This was from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And we know even affectionate emotions is a blessing, and these are things from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We know the famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He loves a servant of His, then He would call upon the peoples of the heavens that I love so and so and love them. And so Angel Jibreel would call upon the people of the angels. He'll tell them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves so and I love so and so love him. And then it would be relayed to the inhabitants of the earth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the people of the heavens love so and so love him. And so you tend to find some people that you meet, it's very easy that they're likable, that you tend to be drawn to them. And this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Musa alayhi salam, whomever laid eyes on him would not help but love him. Of course, there's always exceptions, right? One exception was Fir'aun, obviously. And so that love is not necessarily for everybody, but generally speaking, the believer is easily loved by the believers. Many perhaps of the non-believers that don't have animosity towards Muslims, you find that they're drawn to this individual, but you will always find individuals that would not be, not love a righteous person. And that's very normal, right? The most beloved of creation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who's easy, who's you can love so easily because of his moral values, his character, everything about him, but yet he was hated by the people who took him as an enemy, right? And it's not just because they could find any fault in him, but it's more of an arrogance, right? More of an arrogance. Within his own family, right? Abu Lahab, his uncle himself. But it had to do once again with arrogance. Abu Jahl, right? Himself, although he's not, he's a distant relative, but when he was asked directly, do you think he's lying? He said, no, we never know him to lie. He said, what the problem is then? In the end, it was arrogance. He said, our families are competing. Now they claim a prophet. I'm never going to follow him. Forget this, right? It's not going to happen. So it's more of an arrogance. Had nothing to do with the personality of the Prophet ﷺ himself, right? Wallahu a'lam. Tayyib. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also at the same time, He had made, essentially inspired perhaps, the mother of Musa to send his sister, right, to chase Musa alayhi salam along the river to see what happens to him, right? To follow in suit. So that also, if there's anything that needs to be happening, he would also be protected. This is one of the means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created. Now, once Musa alayhi salam arrived to the shore and the servants of Fir'aun picked him up, right? They picked him up they took him into the palace, and this is where another role came in. And that is the role of the wife of Fir'aun herself, right? So it went from the mother to the sister to the servants, female servants of the slave, to the wife of Fir'aun. Now, when she laid eyes on Fir'aun and on Musa alayhi salam, right, she loved him, right? And this was from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, he mentioned the appeal of Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun, to Fir'aun. He said, لا تقتلوه, don't kill him. عسى أن ينفعنا أو نتخذه ولدا وهم لا يشعرون. She said, don't kill him. Perhaps he might benefit us, or we can take him as a child, right? So Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun, who is obviously from the natives, by the way, they knew this child was not from the natives. They knew this child was from Bani Israel. How did they know that? How would they know that this child is from Bani Israel? Why would anybody? Okay. Remember, this is a year where they slaughter all the children, okay? And so they understood that it was a way to try to avoid their child to being killed or slaughtered. The Aqbat never tend to kill their children, right? They're kind of considered elites, whatever the case is. And so they understood this was a child from Bani Israel. And yet, Asiya, right, she said, don't kill him, right? Perhaps he might benefit us, or we take him as a child, right? So the person who was supposed to slaughter children could not touch Musa alayhi salam. If this child was brought directly to Fir'aun, what would have happened? He would have slaughtered him, right? If any person from the Aqbat tried to appeal to Fir'aun, would it worked? There's a reason that it was Asiya that found, or that Musa alayhi salam was brought to Asiya, because the only person that perhaps could influence Fir'aun was his wife. This is the planning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That it was, Asiya, she was the one that was able to convince him. Now, another aspect, by the way, or kind of almost a hint, which is quite interesting. Now, remember, Fir'aun claimed to be what did Fir'aun claim to be? A god. Good, excellent. Over here, she said, we can take him as a child. What does it tell you about both of them? Did they have children? No, right? Fir'aun was unable to have children. Would a god be deficient? Like, he could see his own deficiency, and yet he claims to be a god, right? It's one of the interesting kind of because this was the year that would slaughter children, and so they understood that this was a way to try to avoid that child to be killed, and so they threw him to the water, right? Perhaps he would survive somewhere else. No, the Aqbat didn't kill their children. Remember, they're the elite of society. They don't kill their children. Because they realized it was a trick to try to save his life. Right? Right. Now, one thing I want to point out too is, once again, Fir'aun was kind of deterred away or moved away from killing Musa alayhi salam, right, by his wife. But one thing that is that some of the scholars of tafsir point out to, they said, a person who is prepared to receive good will receive good. Let me rephrase this. You receive what you're prepared to receive. If it is good, then it is good. If it's bad, then it is bad. One of the verse, right, the wife of Fir'aun, Asiya, she said, وَقَالَتْ امْرَأَةُ فِرْعَوْنَ قُرَّةَ عَيْنٍ لِي وَلَكَ, right? a soothing of the eye, a comfort of the eye for me and you. Fir'aun, he was mentioned in some of the books of tafsir, he said, no, for you, not for me. Right? For you, not for me. So Fir'aun still rejected, like he accepted, like, he agreed to what his wife wanted to do because he realized she wanted children. Right? She's like, she was unable to bear children, and he understood this. But he was always still very suspicious of this child, right? He always had issues with him. And so that's why he said, a soothing of eye for you, not for me.
The reason being is very simply because the wife of Pharaoh was a believer, was a mu'mina, and he was a kafir.
Not yet. Not yet.
Not yet?
Not yet. Right? Not yet. But in the end, she was an individual that was prepared to receive goodness. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave her what she's prepared to receive. Fir'aun, on the other hand, he still received what he's prepared to receive, which is his destruction. Right? The Prophet ﷺ said, تَفَأَلُوا خَيْرًا تَجِدُوهُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, أَنَا عِنْدَ ظَنَّ عَبْدِي بِي. The Prophet ﷺ said, تَفَأَلُوا خَيْرًا, which means be optimistic. Right? You will find what is good. So in Islam, we don't act upon pessimism, because pessimism essentially is how you think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you are optimist, this is how you think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in hadith, I am as my servant thinks of me. If it's good, then it's good. If it's bad, then it's bad. This is why the Prophet ﷺ said in another hadith, مَنْ قَالَ إِنَّ الْقَوْمَ قَدْ هَلَكُوا فَقَدْ أَهْلَكَهُم. Whomever says, the people will be destroyed, then they will be destroyed. Because this is what you think. But if you think, inshallah, Allah will save us. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will provide a means for us. And being optimistic about it and having a good, a very good, thoughts about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, about the things He'll do, then this is what you get. Right? That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, أَنَا عِنْدَ ظَنَّ عَبْدِي بِي. I am as my servant thinks of me. If it's good, then it's good. If it's bad, then it is bad.
And you have the American quote, if you think you can, you can. If you think you can't, you are right.
It's a mental block, ya Shaykh, in the end. Right. So one thing we should learn from this is that we always prepare ourselves for what is good, right? To always be optimistic, to always work for what is better so that we can receive and prepare ourselves for what is better. No matter what kind of situation we're in, this is where it is required most, right? It's not talking about you, mashallah, we're healthy and we're in a good state and then this is where it comes in. No, this thought process is more important. It comes in when we are in a situation that is the opposite of where we want to be, right? So this is when it kind of comes in. Now, at the end of once again, the verse, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, when He describes what Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun, said, عَسَى أَن يَنْفَعْنَا أَوْ نَتَّخِذَهُ وَلَدًا وَهُمْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ. So perhaps He would, He would benefit us, or we take Him as a child, while they do not, or they are unaware. They're unaware of what? Of the planning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Unaware of the planning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has for them in the future. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did something interesting. He said, وَحَرَّمْنَا عَلَيْهِ الْمَرَاضِعَ. Right? وَحَرَّمْنَا, which means we prevented. It's not haram in the sense of prohibited over here. Or it could mean prohibited. So we prohibited him from being nursed. So Musa alayhi salam rejected all the females that tried to nurse him. All the females that tried to nurse him, especially if they were from the Aqbat, right? The servants that were around Fir'aun. And this is something that is important because Musa alayhi salam was fed from his mother, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted only his mother to nurse him. It is said that being nursed affects an individual. Being nursed affects an individual. Now, if we want to talk about, this is obviously from culturally and religiously, but even scientifically, by the way, they find that the person, right, that nurses a child, that child is affected by the properties of the milk of that female, right? In terms, for example, even physiologically, the types of antibodies that they're going to receive, the types of immunity, but even sometimes their temperaments, right? A child is affected by the being the female that nurses them. But this is why it's also important that we try to nurse our infants as much as possible, right? Not to depend, if we can, not to depend on formulas, right? because it does, in the end, they found that it does affect a child psychologically, emotionally, attachments. So many different things are associated with this. And for Allah alam, this is why perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had prevented all the other females to be able to nurse Fir'aun, but his mother, right? His mother was the only one that was able, but it's also for another reason, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had inspired the mother of Musa that don't worry about him, we will return him back to you, right? And this is how when the sister of Fir'aun, right, when the child was crying and nobody could nurse feed him, the sister of Musa alayhi salam spoke to them and said, I know a household that are good that perhaps can benefit him. And so Musa alayhi salam was returned to his mother. And there's a reason behind this. So Musa alayhi salam, what would happen is that he would quite often be sent back to be nursed from his mother. And so he had part of the nature of Bani Israel. Those were individuals that were considered simple, right? Bani Israel were considered simple people. Yes, they were oppressed, but they had goodness in them, right? And so this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted Musa alayhi salam to take that part. But Musa alayhi salam was also raised not in Bani Israel, he was raised in the palace of Fir'aun. And there's a reason behind this, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala perhaps did not want Fir'aun to be raised as a person who is humiliated, right? Who's oppressed. But rather, he be raised as a person who had dignity and nobility. Now, there is an added advantage also to be raised in the house of Fir'aun, is that Musa alayhi salam, growing up in that household, he understood the politics. He understood the way of thinking of the Aqbat and Fir'aun. So that in the future, when he needed, he'll be able to know how to interact and deal with Fir'aun, right? But also part of it is that if you're going to be a leader, you need to acquire the skills of leaders. And the best place to do it is in the household of leaders, right? By the way, this was understood throughout history. This is why, quite often in previous histories, the children of kings and queens and pharaohs, they were trained in specific ways of how to deal with politics, how to talk to people, how to move things around. This is a skill that is required, right? They used to train them from young children so that when they grow up, they would have those skills. And so Musa alayhi salam, right? He was he was in that household, and so he understood and he acquired those skills. Now, one other important thing that I wanted to mention over here is that all this was being planned so that change would happen or would come about to Bani Israel. Now, for this change to happen, where did it come from? It's true from Allah, but did it come from Fir'aun? It come from the Aqbat? Did it come from an outsider? It came from Musa, who was from Bani Israel. It means that if change is to happen, it has to happen from within. It has to happen from within. It doesn't happen from outside. No matter how much, we understand this, by the way, right? No, we see that with our children, or with sometimes students that we have, or employees, or whatever the case is. No matter how much we try to bring change about to an individual, it never happens unless they themselves want to do it. And so for change to happen, it had to happen from within Bani Israel. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Musa from Bani Israel for him to bring out the change. And we know this from the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيْرُ بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيْرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not change the state of a group of people until they change from what is within themselves. Right? And this is a lesson for all of us. Right? This is the same lesson from one generation to the next. It is a pattern. Change has to happen from within, from the individual, right? And then from the entire group. And so if we ever want to rise with this ummah, right, again, to put it back in its rightful position as a beacon for all of humanity, it has to start from within ourselves, right? If we want to show the entire humanity the correct moral compass, we ourselves have to do it first, individually, and then family, and then community. This is how it happens, right? This is how, grassroots movements, that's what it is. Change from within, right? It doesn't come from above. It's not from top to bottom. It's from bottom to top, right? This is why in the end, they usually tell you, you get the ruler you deserve. From the bottom to the top, right? Wallahu a'lam. Of course, this is a general thing, right? There are always exceptions, but generally speaking, this is what happens, right? And by the way, this verse of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He mentions that, it means both ways. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not change the goodness or the state of goodness that people are in into bad until they change what's in themselves, which means they moved away from obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Similarly, they will not go back, change the bad to the good until they change themselves and go back to obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. طيب. Now, last thing I want to point, inshallah, before you can have our chai, and I think this is one of the rare times I'll finish on time because we started earlier. If you look at all the beginning, right? Okay, whenever we think of the story of Musa, right? Who are the figures that come to our mind? When we think of the story of Musa alayhi salam, what figures, personalities, which people come to mind quickly? Fir'aun, what else? Say that again. Somebody said Fir'aun, I can't hear else. Harun, okay, his brother. Asiya, anybody else? That comes later on, right? The first thing comes to your mind, right? So the first thing comes to people's mind is Musa, Harun, and Fir'aun. Some people say Haman. But then later on comes Asiya. Well, but also the mother of Musa alayhi salam. The sister is rarely mentioned, right? But if you want to look at the story, the entire beginning, right, of his coming into this world and then being saved had to do with who? Mother, sister, female slaves, Asiya. Right? Now, even though they're not remembered in history, we have to remember that their roles were pivotal. Their roles were pivotal, right? They were significant figures, even though whatever small part they played their role, their duty, right? The mother of Musa played the role of the mother. Without her, there would be no Musa, right? Does it make sense? So, the females in that story that played the role, that Musa alayhi salam became Musa because they played the role. Each person had a role to play, and this is from how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates the dynamics of everything, right? This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He placed this entire legislation, each individual has a role of where they are, no matter what position they're in. The father has the role of the father. Allah ordered him with a few things. The mother has the role of a mother. They ordered her with a few things she has to fulfill, right? The husband has a role. The wife has a role, right? Children have a role. And then leaders of society have their roles. If we decide to change those norms, right? This is when the family starts crumbling. The children starts dissociating, right? And then the collapse of the society comes about. When we retaliate and decide we want to fulfill those roles, or that we can fulfill that 100 times, which is not realistic. But we have to understand the natural things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put it in place for us, so that we bring it about best change. But also tells us not to forget that there is always people in the background that are involved in a person's success, right? And those have a share in that. And they're always there, even though sometimes you don't think of them first. But they are considered the cornerstones. If it wasn't for Asiya, Musa might have been slaughtered, right? Asiya placed that pressure on Fir'aun. Did she need to do that? No, but she did, right? Yes. So it's kind of interesting in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave an example for the believers, right? The example, ضرب الله مثلا الذين آمنوا, and for the people who disbelieved, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave an example for the believers and the disbelievers. It's interesting that in both situations they used the example of females, right? The examples of females in both situations, Allah A'lam, right? طيب. Uh, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? I'm just going to end with this, right? So when we look at the roles that they played important roles. This reminds us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like, Allah, inna Allah yuhibbu ma'ali al-umur, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves the things that are considered ma'ali of significance, right? Of importance. وَيَكْرَهُ سَفَاسِفَهَا. And He dislikes the insignificant things. Now, unfortunately, if we look how we live our life, we tend to focus on things that are completely insignificant and we build them and make them significant. Right? Well, the important stuff we tend to ignore. Right? That's the reality of it. We tend to pay attention to fine details and make them feel that they are the most important things in our lives and how not to. And it's quite interesting, especially it's more prevalent obviously in the younger generation. I have teenagers, so I kind of I have issues with these things, right? With things that they think important or whatever the case is. And by the way, I kind of, my entertainment is my kids. It's what I do with them, right? They're very sensitive and get embarrassed so quickly, and I tend to do that a lot, right? And I'm like, why do you even care about this? So I kind of play on this a little bit. But it's kind of very interesting, right? That it is these little details that we worry about, right? But what's more important is we ignore. Like, did we reflect on the Quran? Did we do our prayers on time? Are we dutiful to our parents? Did we give people the rights? Did we do our job in the best perfect way we can, right? Were we honest in our behavior with others? Those are the main important things, right? It's not the style of your hair. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not belittling of a person grooming themselves, but we don't sacrifice this for what is more important, right? We don't do that, right? So don't think I'm asking people to, not groom themselves and look disheveled. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about is not to focus on this and worry about it, make it the most important thing in life, and ignore what is more important, right? To seek understanding of this religion, to educate our kids. It is our duty. It's a shame that they are so educated in science and in math, and mashallah, they're excellent in the secular knowledges, but they're poorly educated when it comes to the religious things. Even though this is what is more important if you want to think of weight, because what is more important is what benefits you in the hereafter. This is what benefits you in this world and the hereafter. This is what will protect themselves and future generations, right? Science is good and all this secular knowledge is good. It's amazing. I'm not saying it's not. It'll benefit you in this world, obviously. It would help you provide for your families and so forth. So once again, I'm not belittling it, but you don't take that and sacrifice this, right? But what comes worse is sometimes we use education in school, and I've seen this, and we sacrifice salah or fasting. Like, I get this question so many times. Oh, my son has a test. Is it okay if he breaks his fast in Ramadan? No. It's not okay, right? Your child is fed enough. They're overweight most likely, right? So they can fast a day, they can focus, it's fine, right? I'm being honest, right? As a population, we are overweight. We have to admit this, right? Mashallah, we're not we have enough fat to last us for a few days, okay? So, and then I get the question, Sheikh, my son, he has to wake up early in the morning. Can I make him skip Fajr? No, you don't skip Fajr. You wake him up with Fajr, put him to sleep later on, right? That's not what we do. We don't sacrifice, we don't, for the worldly things, sacrifice our hereafter. That's not what we do, right? And so we have to correct this ideology or this idea. And I have no idea how I went to a tangent from this. Oh yeah, never mind. I was looking at, the important roles that the females in the life of Musa have played, and we should always focus on what is important. All right. Sorry, it was a tangent. طيب. We will stop here. And then next time we are going to focus or move to the next stage of Musa alayhi salam, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not mention anything about how Musa alayhi salam, his childhood was. He moved right away when he was young, right? When he grew up and he was developed and something happened to him. This is what we're going to pick up next week. Next week, inshallah. All right? جزاكم الله خير سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. Please help yourself to, at the back there's some chai, there's some some snacks, and then we have 15 minutes until Aisha. جزاكم الله خير. If you guys have any questions, I can take them. If not, please make your way to the back. Yes. Do I have what? You're okay? You're good? طيب. You change your mind?